thanks for joining us. My name is Dan Burnston, and I'm the co-managing editor of the Brains blog, the third session of our series of Brains blog roundtables. These are a series of video chats where we're bringing together people working on interesting topics in philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, and adjacent areas to talk with them about their work, with them about what they're currently passionate about in the field, and so we can learn a little bit about how things are working in specific areas of the field. Today, I'm very excited for our topic. It's the topic I know the least about out of the Brains blog roundtables that we've done, so I'm particularly in a really good position to learn a lot today. Today's topic is values in cognitive science. So one way into this is to think about a traditional view about the relationship between value and science in general. A very standard view, which has come to be known as the value-free ideal, is that our values, speaking very broadly, these can include our moral values, our political values, even our economic values, just have nothing to do with science or shouldn't have anything to do with science. Science is an objective source of knowledge, free of all these things. A wide range of projects in philosophy of science generally have started to really question this kind of ideal and argued that values are an important part of the practice of science, even perhaps the epistemology of science. Speaking of cognitive science specifically, there's a really interesting intersection here because when we study specifically human psychology, we are able to think about the psychological processes underlying what we value, right? Underlying the intuitions we have about values in all of these other domains. So thinking about these kinds of questions in cognitive science and psychology gives a really kind of rich venue in which to play out some of these interactions between what we value and the kinds of sciences that we do. So that's the topic for today. All of our panelists, at least in broad strokes, are working on things related to this area. So I'm very excited about our three panelists today, and I will introduce them in no particular order. So I guess it's going counterclockwise on my screen. I don't know if it shows up the same for everyone. But so anyway, first up is Morgan Thompson, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Bielefeld University, working specifically on the project Integrating Ethics and Epistemology in Scientific Research. She's done some already extremely influential work on the gender gap in philosophy, both kind of studying it empirically, but also analyzing it philosophically, thinking about the causes of this phenomenon. This has been really important and influential work. Also, some of her primary work, Morgan, your dissertation research, which I got to read some of a couple of years ago, which was great, on robustness and operationalization of concepts in psychology. And recently doing some work, including a recent paper, I think, pursuing some of these issues and talking about the scientific study of microaggressions is a new paper you have out, right? So I haven't read the whole thing, but I'm very excited to take a look at that paper. It's a really nice place where some of these kind of social issues come to rest against the scientific and philosophical issues. So Morgan, thanks very much for being here. Next up is Sam Liao, who is an associate professor in the philosophy department at the University of Puget Sound in Washington State. I haven't been there, it looks very beautiful. Sam works on a really, really interesting array of topics at the intersection of, I guess I would call it philosophy of mind, ethics, and aesthetics. So including on the nature of imagination and its role in moral and aesthetic thinking. Also work in the experimental philosophy of aesthetic concepts and a little bit on philosophical intuitions as well. So really rich set of resources to bring to bear to the discussion today. Sam, we're really happy to have you. And then last but certainly not least is Uwe Peters, who's a postdoctoral researcher both at the Center for Science and Thought at University of Bonn in Germany and at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge. So a lot going on there. So Uwe's work is at the intersection. I would describe it as kind of philosophy of mind and psychology, but also philosophy of science. A bunch of interesting stuff, including on the kinds of thought that's operative in things like confirmation bias and political polarization. also the role and value of demographic and cognitive diversity in science, a little bit about science and value. Again, really a cool set of topics and really a fun set of things to bring to this discussion. So I'm really happy to have you all here. And we're going to start out by having each of you say, really brief introduction to some of your current research, a little bit about why you think that's the important research to pursue right now. So I guess we'll go in the same order. Morgan, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so I think thanks for the invitation, and also thank you for that nice introduction. So my research generally is concerned with how we take social concepts, things like microaggressions or intersectionality, and apply them in scientific contexts. And in order to do that, we need to first kind of understand how we want to characterize these complex social concepts in a particular research setting. And we also need to figure out how we want to measure when these concepts will actually apply in the context we're interested in. So you might think about concepts like race, for example. In a lot of scientific research and social science, we might want to categorize people by race in order to measure certain discriminatory effects in society. One problem that shows up is how exactly we ought to operationalize race when we're collecting this particular data. So Germany is actually a really interesting case study here because at the national level, they don't collect information about race. So in fact, although the EU has suggested that the European countries should look for how racial discrimination plays out in health contexts or other settings, they can't actually look for this because they've not tested for race, and instead they analyze a different way of categorizing people, which is a migration background. So I'm interested in how these kinds of ethical and epistemological and political questions arise when we're trying to use these kinds of social concepts in our social science research. So one particular question that I've been working on recently is how we characterize and measure racial discrimination. And this is really important for a number of domains, but particularly in public health research, because there's a lot of countries that have racial health disparities among their populations. And one thing public health researchers want to do is to causally explain why those health disparities arise. Racial discrimination is one of the major potential contributing factors to these disparities. But in order to measure how racial discrimination could possibly create these kinds of negative health impacts, these public health researchers need to figure out how they want to characterize what racial discrimination is and what sort of methods or measurements they want to use to study when racial discrimination has actually occurred for a particular person. I mostly have been looking at psychology and sociology perspectives on racial discrimination so far. And there you often find that researchers are applying a kind of self-report method. So what they're really measuring is something like people's experiences of racial discrimination, which is importantly related to kind of theories we might have in social theory about what racial discrimination is and why it's bad. But there's also slight differences with this characterization. So I'm interested in questions about when it's appropriate to kind of change our concepts in this way. How do we weight these ethical, epistemic, and political trade-offs? And also have a particular argument about why there are kind of different types of discriminatory experiences, some of which these measures actually capture, and actually some that they don't. So I argue we also need different measures to better capture experiences of racial discrimination.
Cool, wow, thank you. I mean, even just in there, you see the complexity when you start to get some of these scientific and political things involved there. Yeah, really, really fascinating stuff. So we'll definitely come back to some of this. I guess we'll keep going in the same order. So Sam, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, great. Thank you so much. And thanks to Brains blog for hosting this. So as Dan mentioned, I worked on imagination, I've worked on experimental philosophy, and I still work on those things. But my current project is about how oppression gets materialized in our cognitive environment in these like super ordinary ways. And in fact, so ordinary that almost like you don't notice it and like often feels naturalized. So that's what I've been thinking about a lot. There are different ways to get to this picture. Here's one sort of way that I've been thinking about it. So suppose you accept a broadly general picture on which cognition is situated, distributed, embodied, embedded, and so on. Then the world plays an important role in cognition, right? And then suppose you also accept, as I do, that the world is built by lots of oppressive systems like racism, sexism, ableism, and so on. Then it's not surprising that this world built by these oppressive systems ends up influencing our cognition in particular ways. Right? In fact, I probably want to make a stronger claim, which is that the influence is not just one way. There's kind of reciprocal causal interaction between mind and world. And sometimes I get pulled such that I want to make a possibly stronger claim, this sort of extended mind claim that they're kind of mutually constitutive of one another. Right? And I think this shows up in all sorts of places. So I thought about it in relation to photographic technologies, like literally cameras or film stocks or Instagram filters, and soap dispensers. And I've also thought about it with like medical devices, like oximeters and spirometers. And I thought about it with like monuments and memorials, like in Taiwan, the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall. And recently, since I've been bringing the kids to a park a lot, I've been starting to think about it in relation to like playground equipment. So I feel like this is something interesting for me to think about. One, because I think it's true and I like to write true things, but also just because I started noticing all the stuff around me. And I feel like it's a helpful way to think about lots of stuff that I navigate everyday world with. Right? And I'll just mention like there are a few other ways you can get to this picture. So suppose you subscribe to like a broadly cultural cognition picture. Lots of times people talk about like sunny side of culture, but of course like oppression is very much a part of culture too, where part of culture is people build these hierarchical systems, right? So you can get it from that root too. You can get through it from a kind of a biology picture of like niche construction, thinking about like different cognitive niches we construct. You can get to this picture from like an STS kind of picture, think about technology and sort of material artifacts we have. You can also get to it from like a lot of specific domains, like thinking about AI, thinking about urbanism and so on. So I just want to mention that there are lots of roots to this general picture about how oppression gets materialized in our cognitive environment. But I just want to mention one that I've been coming from. Right? And I should say that although this is my current research project, the general project I think is very much a work of distributed cognition also. So I started thinking about this in conversation with Bryce Huebner, who's my co-author on the Oppressive Things paper. I've been thinking about it lately on the medicine stuff with Vanessa Carbonell. I basically really don't like thinking by myself. I hate being trapped with my own thoughts. So, I really like talking with other people. So if other people want to think with me on some of these topics, that'll be definitely very welcome too.
Awesome, cool, thanks. Yeah, I mean, the application of the distributed cognition to these things seems so apt and really so rich. And yeah, obviously we love collaborations at the Brains Blog. So who knows, maybe we'll spawn some today. Great, thanks, Sam. So Uwe, do you wanna bring us around the bend here?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for having me, first of all. And it sounds all really sort of interesting to get to know your work. And it's kind of related. I think some of these things that Morgan and Sam that you're working on is actually sort of rather closely related to what I'm working on too. But at the moment, so I have this kind of joint position, sort of it's, so I'm working in Bonn, but then also in Cambridge, and that's also related to AI. You know, AI is sort of big deal at the moment. I guess there's a lot of money and it's being pumped into this sort of area. And I'm working on AI and basically sort of, you know, what are the the ethical or epistemic risks of AI, and specifically at the moment, I have this kind of project. I mean, I don't really have one particular project at a time. I do lots of things at the same time. I guess you're probably the same. So sort of what I'm primarily working on at the moment is sort of the transparency of AI algorithms, right? So the idea is that you've got increasingly more AI algorithms, they take over human decision making, right? So about, say, job application screening, and then medical diagnoses, and even prison terms, right? So you've got AI algorithms that make the decisions there, right? And people tend to then ask the question, okay, well, what are these decisions based on, right? And then it turns out that these algorithms, given that they are based on machine learning, so they basically program themselves in a sense. The algorithms, so the rules that they operate on are basically too complex, in some cases too complex for human programmers to understand. So you've got this kind of problem that the system or the basis of their decisions is no longer fully transparent, right? You've got people asking for, a reason for the decision that you're now being rejected, right? Say, you've just submitted the job application and now you won't get it. And then the issue is, okay, well, how can we trust these systems, right? If they don't really provide an explanation for their decisions, right? And this is sort of the transparency of AI. And a lot of cognitive scientists, or sort of empirically oriented, maybe AI researchers, they've argued that actually when you look at human beings, right, so we too, right, in some cases we are not really fully transparent either, right? We do a lot of confabulation and there's a lot of post hoc rationalization going on. So it looks like actually we're on a path. So some philosophers argue really, right, I mean, there's an equal opacity when it comes to AI systems and human beings. And what I'm working on at the moment is just, to what extent does this actually hold, this claim about equal opacity there? And I'm looking at it, I think, more from a meta science perspective. So I look at sort of the basis that the philosophers have when they claim that human agents are opaque. I mean, you've got this work by Peter Carruthers and others that, right, I mean, we're not really able to introspect our own reasons. And I'm sort of looking at the actual evidence, right? I mean, what do the data actually tell us, right? And I think it's quite interesting that I think the data isn't really that conclusive. So I think a lot of philosophers tend to think that really this is solid. But when you look more closely at it, I don't think there's good support for the idea that there's an equal opacity there. And the issue is important, I think, at the moment, because you've got these systems taking over human decision-making, right? And then the whole issue of trustworthiness arises, right? I mean, can we or should we trust these systems? Should they be more transparent than human agents, right? So I think these are sort of practically, ethically, and epistemically important issues. And that's why I'm sort of working on it at the moment. Thanks.
Awesome, cool, thanks. Yeah, this actually happens a lot, and it makes me realize that we've selected good people when I try to give the summary of the body of research so far, and now everyone's new projects are going off in these new and exciting directions and so forth. So definitely the case with all of you today. So great. So we've got a ton of cool stuff to draw on here. So I wanted to start with a pretty broad, kind of almost methodological point. And that there seems to me to be kind of two ways we can think about values, again, construed very broadly: social, political, economic, moral values on the one hand, and cognitive science research on the other. So on the one hand, we can use cognitive science to better understand why we have the values we do, right? So we can investigate the kinds of thought process underlying, just for example, political values. What produces judgments about political values. But on the other hand, we can also do the thing that people have talked about doing in philosophy of science more generally, which is to kind of use values as a kind of shaping device for the scientific research itself. So to shape the kinds of projects that we do, to shape the kinds of methods that we find important or valuable within the scientific enterprise. So I wanted to kind of start by asking you all about that dichotomy. Is that just something I made up? Is it a false dichotomy? Do these play different roles in your work, or are they all kind of jumbled up together? how do you think about this kind of interplay? So I guess I was going to ask Morgan if you could get us started, and then we'll kind of have open conversation.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I thought this was a really interesting question. And it in fact reminded me a bit of kind of like points that Elizabeth Anderson actually makes in the values in science literature as well. So there's tons of discussion in philosophy of science about how values can influence science. And, one of the major accepted ways that values play a role in science, I guess, would be on questions about kind of framing and also what we actually choose to study. So I do think that this kind of thing can influence the way that we might do cognitive science projects. So I was thinking about cases where, neuroscientists, for example, tend to look for gender differences in a lot of different cases. And in fact, if you go and look at some of the grants that are funding some of this research, the kind of objectives of this research are very applied. They're actually supposed to be things, we're supposed to learn about why certain psychiatric disorders are more prevalent in women than in men, for example. But the research is incredibly far removed. It's actually, some of this neuroscience research isn't really looking at functions at all, and in fact is just looking for structural differences. So I think taking a kind of values lens on why this kind of research is happening and how we could do it better is a place where philosophers could help a lot kind of figure out why we're kind of taking these kinds of assumptions. So one idea would be to look to what appropriate outcomes of this kind of research would be. So maybe this research is really actually just too much basic research to be of use to that kind of applied question. But I do think that actually what is really interesting about this question is the extent to which kind of cognitive science or evidence in general can play a role in our values and figuring out what we value. I mean, there's the sense that you mentioned, Dan, which is kind of like, how might we learn what values people actually hold in a particular context, or what this community holds generally. And I think those are interesting questions, but I think there's other ones too. So to bring back this idea from Elizabeth Anderson, she wants to say that we can actually hold our values in a non-dogmatic way. And so this is really important for values in science debate. If we want to say, our values play a role in science, why doesn't this lead to kind of wishful thinking? We'll just find confirmation for anything that we already think on the basis of our values that we'll find in our research. That would be a kind of bad situation for science. But Elizabeth Anderson says if we hold our values non-dogmatically, then this won't be such a problem. And her suggestion of why we might, actually evaluate our own values and change our values is that she thinks emotions can actually give some evidence for values. So when you have emotional responses, like for some particular experience, then this can be some evidence about the appropriateness of the kind of values that led to that situation. So I thought that was a one way that cognitive science might be able to contribute to questions about what values we should hold and how we might change those.
I was muted, the never-ending Zoom melody. Yeah, cool, right. So like this kind of like non-dogmatic holding of values allows us to be informed or even shape our values over time. Yeah, that's a really cool point. Uwe and Sam, do you want to add in at all? Yeah, Uwe, go ahead.
So I'm actually sort of a great fan of Elizabeth Anderson's work, and I've sort of written a paper in kind of support of her view, but I disagree a bit on the issue that wishful thinking is kind of per se bad in science. I wonder if that's the case, or even confirmation bias is per se bad. And she wants to say, well, yes, right, because then it could lead to dogmatism, and then maybe to predetermined conclusions, and that's driven to those conclusions. But I think maybe it'd be helpful, and I think maybe cognitive science comes in there too, to think of it in terms of moving away, and maybe that's also related to Sam's work, moving away from sort of the individualistic kind of picture, right, where you have an individual that has these kind of cognitive tendencies, and in that individual's cognition, it leads to these bad outcomes. But maybe if you look at it, you know, at the group level, where you just have people collaborate and criticize each other, right? Maybe then you end up with more epistemic, say, benefits at the group level, even though you've got these really bad cognitive tendencies at the individual level, right? So maybe we shouldn't be too much focused on the individual. Maybe we want to adopt maybe a broader view, right? And yeah, so maybe it's related even to distributed cognition. I don't know, Sam, what do you think? Because it looks like it's a bit kind of distributed, and like, because it's group cognition, I guess, in a sense. Like,
I think I agree with what you just said, which is that I mean, this is like the sort of result where like what might be good at an individual level might not be what's good at a group level, and what might be bad at an individual level and that might not be what's bad at the group level, right? So I certainly think that's right. I don't know if I have like any super informative thoughts on like the more abstract question of like whether how the values figure in. I think of like my own work as trying to maybe kind of push back against a way in which people often think things are value neutral, but it isn't. So I think that's the thing with like lots of these material objects and spaces in the world. People kind of think of them as neutral, but they aren't. And obviously with you guys' work too, like you think about like technology, but I also even think like in the kind of 4E cognition literature, sometimes people talk in a relatively value neutral way, or like when they talk about like cognitive extension, often they think they focus more on like the sunny side of like these are the things that makes humans so smart, right? But then like what do we do with those smartness? Like, well, sometimes we do like really bad things with those smartness. So it means, in fact, it makes us really, really good at reinforcing like all those hierarchies that we have in our society. So I think there's a way in which that literature can give off a feel of a little bit value neutrality where there isn't. And I think of my work as pushing back on that, but I'm sort of like agnostic. I was sort of just thinking a lot about this question, and I'm not sure what I think on the fully idealized abstract level, but I feel like right now in the pragmatic real world level, we can push back against some assumptions of value neutrality in different places.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of like brings it directly back around, right? So you know, certainly in the gender differences in neuroscience case, which I've read a little bit on, you know, there is this kind of idea of like, oh, okay, we're just doing like basic biological research, but there is this kind of you notice these kinds of very standard and in some ways stereotyped assumptions about gender getting into that research in some level. Robin Bloom has a nice paper about this actually that I teach to my philosophy of science class. Right, so you know, you've got this kind of like assumption of neutrality working, but in fact, like there's actually social values kind of implicit in it. And then, of course, that's all happening in a group setting, in a distributive setting, right? So there's this kind of interplay of the potential and potential drawbacks there. I mean, I think that's all really right.
I guess.
Yeah,
so let me just add a little bit. Like, I guess here's the way I think about it, right? Like, whether you're like committed to, in the end, like in the most abstract, idealized sense, whether you're committed to like a value-free ideal of science and cognitive science, or whether you're committed to like some kind of value-laden ideal, it would be useful to figure out whether like in the real world certain things are value-laden or not, right? So if you believe in a value-free ideal, you want to get rid of those values, and if you care about like it being value-laden, we should figure out whether those are in fact the kind of values we want to hold, right? So I feel like that's a kind of useful first step, regardless of what your ideal picture is.
Yeah,
that's I think that's a great point. Sorry, Uwe, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so maybe so the idea sort of a value free science, maybe we have to sort of distinguish there. I mean, it's a very general claim, right? When you say, okay, well, can science be value-free, yes or no? And maybe it differs, right? I mean, if you look at, I mean, take for instance cognitive science, and take the case where suppose I want to find out whether some sort of mindfulness-based intervention, right, can somehow has an effect on the way people value, say, a burger, right? I mean, I can run a study, and it's not obvious. I mean, that tells me something about people's values in a sense, but it's not clear to me that there's any value coming in. Now, I agree with the idea that when you operationalize things, you often, especially when it comes to thick concepts, and maybe Morgan, you can say more on this, when it comes to thick concepts, maybe then there is an issue there that actually values come in. But maybe we want to be more, maybe the things, it's a bit more complex, right? And so, right, maybe there is science that is value-free, but then there are other areas that aren't value-free or less so. And then the other thing that I wanted to just add is also related to sort of the interactionist kind of line of thought. And then that's, I really like the Ian Hacking's work on looping effects, right? Where you just have, I mean, you've got psychiatry, Morgan, because you brought it up, when you have people, you diagnose people with a certain mental disorder. And I mean, that looks like, okay, well, it's helpful. It looks like it helps. So it's just, you're trying to help these people, and it looks like you're just being objective there. It looks like you're not actually shaping anyone. You're just telling them what is the case, predetermined facts, as it were. But then, I mean, what Hacking, I think, quite convincingly shows is that actually, when you do this, when you socially classify people, you actually do bring about changes, right? And you effectively, the target moves, right, in this case. And I think that's maybe something that you also want to keep in mind, right? Because then you can probably argue that any kind of science that involves social classification is going to bring in some kind of mind-shaping effect, and therefore it's going to be at some point normatively problematic, right? I don't know. Yeah.
Morgan, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly to mention the idea of thick concepts. Yeah, because I think this is a really interesting question, is like, yeah, when you have concepts like racial discrimination that both have a kind of normative component. So we think racial discrimination is interesting because we think it's wrong. Obviously, there are different theories about why exactly it's wrong. But we do think that it's normatively bad. But there's also descriptive content too, right? There are kinds of behaviors that we think are typically kind of examples of discriminatory behavior. And then we have like less clear cases as well. So when science wants to use these kinds of concepts, we have to figure out how to deal with the kind of normative side of the concept as well. And it's important to do this work. It's not like we should just give up the project, right? We want to actually learn more about where discrimination is happening in the world, how we might intervene, what kinds of causal effects it has. So this project is really important, but sometimes we do need to change the concepts that we're using to make them better suited for scientific purposes. So we do need to make them more refined. We need to leave some aspects of it out. So kind of what are the problems of changing any normative dimensions of these thick concepts? I think that's a really interesting and important question.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, I even as we talk, I'm really just becoming convinced that there is kind of normative stuff kind of just shot through these kinds of, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm like just very convinced at the moment, and I'll downgrade my view later. But if anyone else wants to chime in, I'm happy. But that also leads us into directly the next topic, right? So it turns into a nice kind of segue. Because the next thing I wanted to talk about was diversity as a particular value, right? So I think all of you in your kind of broader philosophical lives have made this a value in kind of different ways. So I was wondering if we might kind of talk either based on your written work or just kind of your thoughts in general about the profession, or epistemically in general, why diversity itself might be a kind of good, right? So we often say here it's good to diversify, or it's better if a field is diverse in certain kinds of respects, right? For instance, in terms of certain kinds of demographic, ethnic backgrounds, and so forth. I think we hear a little bit less about why that might be a cognitive or epistemic good. And it seems like all of you are in a position to have kind of thoughts about this. So I was hoping we could talk about that a little bit. Sam, do you have thoughts on this? Do you want to get started, or?
Sure. I'll get started. Yeah. So I feel like my first thought, which is not that original, is just to cite like the classic Hong and Page result about how diversity itself is good if there's cognitive diversity, could produce better results than just a bunch of people with high ability but not cognitively diverse, right? So I think that's like one good reason to think cognitive diversity is itself good, and relates to some of the mechanism that came up earlier in the roundtable about how we can have lots of flawed individuals, but then as a group that can still produce good outcomes if it's arranged appropriately. For example, if arranged in a way that preserves cognitive diversity. And I guess in some of my other work, I do think diversity in the sense is important. So I've done work with Mina Krishnamurthy and other people on kind of underrepresentation of women in philosophy journals. So that's kind of more about demographic diversity, but I think that's an area worth studying, and I really like Morgan's work in this vicinity as well. I guess the one thought I would add from my more own recent work would be there's a lot in this literature that's about still kind of individualistic in thinking about cognitive diversity at individual level, but then I'm a materialist. I think our material environment really matters, right? So maybe one thing we should look for is thinking about ways increasing diversity in cognitive niches, in diversity in cognitive environments, so that there can be different kinds of thinkers if we believe diversity is a good, right? And so that we don't just look at it at an individual level, but also think about the kind of objects and spaces we have in the world, the kind of social structures that we have, so that we can ensure that there's not just cognitively diverse thinkers, but cognitively diverse thinking environments.
Yeah, that's a really cool point. So I think let's go to Morgan first, because I'm interested in thinking about diversity in a field specifically, but this is gonna, I think, loop back around to yourself as well. So Morgan, why don't you go next, and then we'll loop around.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I've done some research already about kind of why philosophy as a profession looks so white and so male. And there's, a lot of interesting questions because this happens already at the undergraduate level. And so we're already kind of losing social diversity. And I've done some empirical work asking undergraduates kind of about their experiences in the classroom. And although there's some evidence that there also might be things and ideas people bring into the classroom that make them less excited about philosophy generally, it's just they have to take the course. So I think there's a lot of interesting empirical questions, but the broader question of how this kind of social diversity relates to cognitive diversity, I think is really interesting and important. And I was thinking there's really good arguments as well that come from standpoint theory, which is, when you have social groups that kind of get together to think about the ways in which the structures kind of cause inequality or lead to oppression, the kinds of experiences that they actually focus, they can actually achieve a kind of standpoint from which they view those experiences. And standpoint theorists have argued that that is actually knowledge that they have in virtue of having this kind of standpoint that that they've developed. And so if you have people from socially diverse groups and they get together to kind of form this standpoint, seeing kind of from their perspective how the social structures kind of hinder them in various ways. I mean, this is actual knowledge that they can contribute to a discipline or a problem, depending on what the topic actually is. So this is at least one mechanism by which we might think that social diversity influences cognitive diversity as well.
Yeah, great. I mean, I love bringing in the standpoint thing here. I think that's exactly kind of one of the things that's important. I'm going to insert a quick anecdote. So some of our grad students at Tulane have taught philosophy in local prisons. And one of our grad students recently had the experience of teaching Rawls' Veil of Ignorance thought experiment to a prison population. And apparently the students in this class just didn't find it easy to engage with that kind of mental space you have to get into. And you might be tempted to say, well, they didn't get it. And Kalina's experience was, no, they got it. They just didn't think it was a good thought experiment that would represent their interests in that space, right? So people who are from a systematically underprivileged, part of the country, poor neighborhoods in New Orleans, for instance, right, had a kind of distinctive set of problems with that very classic philosophical thought experiment. So this is just an example recently of something where I think you see that exact thing playing out. Yeah, great. But this also shows up in the context of the institution of science and scientific communities itself as well. So Uwe, I know you've worked on that a little bit. You want to say a little more?
Yeah. If I may, I would just like to maybe say two things on what Sam and Morgan said.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think your point, Sam, about sort of focusing on artifacts and diversity there, I think this is kind of really important, not just say for ethical reasons and so on, but also if you just look at the replication crisis, right? I mean, one of the issues there is that you get these replication failures because people like experimental psychologists, they tend to use the same instruments, right? I mean, there isn't a great deal of variation there, or the context, right? There isn't any, what they're trying to do now is they're trying to run studies sort of in multiple labs at the same time, and then that they don't just focus on variability with respect to subjects, right? But they control for that, but typically there isn't really anything with respect to the stimuli, right? So they are just assumed to hold across the board, right? But there may also be variation there. So you need to bring that in. You need to diversify the artifacts, i.e. the sort of the instruments that you use to test people with too, right? To get more robust, I think, cognitive scientific findings. So I think this is definitely, I think you're right on that. So that's a great point. But I just wanted to also maybe add, so what sort of came out, I think, a little bit was that cognitive diversity seems to be really important. So it's not really, so it sounded a bit like, and that's a common view, I think, in the philosophy of science, that you have like demographic diversity, and that sort of mediates cognitive diversity, and cognitive diversity is really the thing that we want, right? Because that's where we get the epistemic benefits from, right? Because, right, if you have different individuals, you got them criticize each other, and therefore you've got these individual idiosyncrasies, right? The weaknesses and individuals' reasons they get canceled out. But I wonder if that is true. So I wonder if it's true that we need to have some sort of if we really need to have cognitive diversity. What I want to suggest is that, and that sort of harks back to what Catherine Phillips has been saying, and that's the idea that even if you just have if you have individuals in a group and they see that they are different, there are people that are just different from them, maybe because they act differently or they just look different, then even if you have homogeneity with respect to the cognitive diversity, you still have them see these these superficial differences, and they expect that there's maybe then going to be more resistance, right, with respect to what they're going to say, because they see these different individuals and they just don't know whether there's cognitive diversity, right? And suppose you do not have any cognitive diversity, you're still going to get epistemic benefits from the demographic diversity, right? So I think that's sort of it's sort of maybe important because that tends to get overlooked by a lot of philosophers of science. So they focus, I think, sort of rightly on the cognitive diversity, but maybe you get epistemic benefits even out of demographic diversity, right? And I think that may be good to have in mind there too. Yeah. Because
can I
Yeah,
just
go ahead, Morgan. I just realized you couldn't see who I was pointing at on my Zoom screen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know about this work, but it does seem to go counter also to a lot of the projects in kind of Black feminist epistemology, where some of this work is coming out as well. Because there, I'm thinking about like a kind of idea that Patricia Hill Collins raises in her book, which is you sometimes get when you're looking at like social diversity, like if Black people are trying to kind of fit into science, like get into the institution of science, get a position where they can, you know, be counted as scientists and contribute to this knowledge in a kind of formal sense, there's a bit of selection, both kind of by what other people in science will accept, the ideas that they'll accept from these people. They won't accept some of the kind of more radical claims of the theorizing that Black people might do about their own lives. And also there's a bit of selection for the people themselves, because there's a kind of credit economy as well. You need to kind of fit in with the kinds of projects that science is already pursuing. And when it's underdeveloped in this area of what Black lives are like and how we theorize about them, then if you come in and kind of have all of these ideas that kind of go very much against the mainstream, you're not seen as a kind of good authority on these kinds of ideas, because you don't fit the general kind of picture of scientist as well. So there's also a kind of some theoretical reasons to think maybe this also doesn't apply in some cases. I don't know, but that's interesting empirical work.
Yeah, I love to learn more about it. I feel like it's an interesting open question. Like, can you get cognitive diversity? Sorry, can you get epistemic benefits without cognitive diversity, with just diversity on some other dimension? And I'll be super interested in learning about it. I guess just like sort of pragmatic, I feel like it's easier to make the argument because like lots of people already accept cognitive diversity is good. And then if you can also show that demographic diversity, social diversity leads to cognitive diversity, then that's sort of like an easier argumentative path. But I'll be super interested in learning more about this work.
I mean, I just want to maybe add that I think it is, if you look at the overall, if you do a cost-benefit analysis, I guess you're going to find that that having cognitive diversity, like having it actually sort of being in place, is going to be much better, because if it isn't in place, then you get less social criticism, right? Because, right, I mean, there isn't any foundation for that social criticism, right? So you don't get a lot of pushback, but you still have, you know, you do have, I guess, some kind of, I mean, there's going to be some benefits, because people just, if they see a heterogeneous group, I mean, they're going to maybe are less likely to assume that whatever they say is going to be quickly accepted, right? Than otherwise. So I think we do maybe want to hold on to the common thought that cognitive diversity is really important, but we maybe also want to factor in that other component, because, right, you could have, I mean, this whole notion of invisible diversity, where you have lesbians and gay and LGBTQ people. I mean, the question then is, this is sort of invisible diversity, and that rarely gets discussed, right? And I think it's important, right? And I think, and also maybe ageism, there's the diversity with respect to these dimensions. I guess ageism, you do see that, so it's probably visible. But when it comes to sexual orientation, I think it's really important that this gets discussed, and, you know, that people maybe think about, should it be then made visible, and would that be then helpful? Yes or no, right? Yeah, so I think it'd be great to see more on this.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe you get like a direct effect, and then like you get an indirect effect also. Like someone should do like a DAG of like how the difference or diversity can reach like epistemic benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah, if only there were a paper out there about causal interpretations of intersectionality, which is a paper that Morgan and Liam Kofi wrote a couple of years ago. It just seems like a a great case of this, right? Where you've got multiple intersecting factors, and in some cases, the kind of benefit that Uwe is talking about may be counteracted, right, by some kind of discounting or something, in the sense that Morgan's talking about. I mean, I wasn't familiar with this idea, but actually like this idea that just as a baseline, just the recognition of possible demographic diversity in the room, like, makes you a little more open-minded. Like, I think that's a really cool idea that I hadn't really thought of before. But of course, it's not in conflict necessarily with some of these other goods that we've been talking.
I mean,
yeah,
sorry, just like one more stray thought on this. So like, there's some results that show like it might be more informative to ask people not what they think about some topic, but like what they think other people think. Then, because sort of like it's like kind of wisdom of the crowd, right? Like sort of implicitly sample what's around them. So I think like one thing that goes nicely with your thought would be like, if you kind of at least make salient the difference or other people around them, then when you're doing this kind of sampling, you're going to get a better result.
Yeah, that sounds like something you could definitely go out and study. I don't know if anyone's done it, but.
Sorry, can I just also
go
say Daniel Malinsky is also an author on the intersectionality paper.
Yes, I apologize. I knew there was a third author, but I couldn't remember who it was. So thank you for pointing that out. Great, cool. Yeah, so this is all really, really fascinating. I just really, even in my own head, just having a discussion, it kind of deepens my own understanding of the possible ways in which diversity could be an epistemic and social good. Great. So I want to kind of move into a little bit of a test case here. One that I find difficult, for instance, in my own teaching life, which is the case of implicit bias. So this is an idea that has made it into the public sphere, is kind of taken as a kind of baseline truth in much of social institutional discourse, for instance. I've had whole trainings at Tulane to be part of hiring committees where the whole thing is about implicit bias. And yet, while I'm not an expert, there's a lot of controversy about the empirical results surrounding implicit bias. Controversy about whether implicit association tests measure anything valuable. Controversy about how well operationalized the idea of an implicit attitude is in general, right? So when I teach this stuff to my students, I end up in kind of an interesting place, because I don't necessarily, I personally think implicit bias is a thing, but the scientific basis for believing that is not as maybe firm as the widespread adoption of the idea would suggest, I guess, is a way of putting it. So this strikes me as just a really interesting case where you've got this kind of really important idea for pursuing certain kinds of values, for instance, anti-racist values in the public sphere, and yet the science is in some ways kind of lagging behind. Again, I'm not an expert, that's my understanding from talking to people who know better than me, some of whom are on this panel, right? How do we think about kind of the importance of this idea for social discourse versus where the science stands, and how do we kind of move forward with a really fraught idea like this? Uwe, I had you up first because you've recently written about implicit bias, but I'm sure we all have thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think I have a lot of thoughts on this, but so maybe just to pick up your last point there. So yeah, when it comes to what the public maybe hears about implicit bias and what the science actually can sort of confirm, I think that there's a danger there, and I think people realize that. So I think there's a danger there in maybe exaggerating the claims, right? When you look at the science, and then you are convinced you are egalitarians. I mean, we're all probably, I guess, egalitarians, and that leads you maybe to then also take the bit of science that you have to make these general claims that implicit bias is kind of real and everyone has it. And I think what I just want to suggest here, maybe just as a point of discussion, and what I just want to suggest is that there's this research on descriptive norms, right? And basically the idea there is that if you tell people that that everyone has a certain negative trait, right? Everyone is biased, everyone stereotypes, then that is going to actually increase the stereotyping tendency among the individuals in the audience, because they kind of think, well, okay, well, if everyone does it, I mean, then it probably is it, maybe it's adaptive, right? So, you know, they also then are more, I mean, maybe less careful when they engage in social interactions, right? Because yeah, everyone is stereotypes, right? That's what they tell me, right? And they tell me this with good intentions, right? Because they want, they right? You tell this your students, and I tell it my students, because I want to raise awareness. But the problem then is how can we do this without sort of fueling the problem of contributing to the problem, right? Are there ways that we should maybe keep in mind? And that's to do with cognitive science, right? Because it's science communication, we need to, I think, take on board what cognitive science tells us about the perception of messages, right? And I think when we as egalitarians want to sort of change these social injustices, right? I mean, maybe we should then also keep these points about descriptive norms in mind, and then just think about how to phrase it, right? And then, like, you can say it like many people have implicit biases, and that's going to take away so the descriptive norms, they rely on you generalizing, right? So you have a claim, and then you just say, well, everyone does it, so I might as well do it too. But if you only know that some people do it or many people do it, you cannot that easily generalize, and that means the tendency for you to behaviorally confirm that too is going to be undercut, right? So what I want to suggest is that maybe so when it comes to the difference between what we tell people about implicit bias and what the science tells us, there's something that we should keep in mind, because we're effectively bridging these two domains, right? I mean, not every day, but I mean, I'm currently actually teaching a seminar on biases, and I'm repeatedly, pretty much every time when I talk about a different kind of dimension of those bias, I'm tempted to say, well, it's real, right? And everyone has it. But I mean, there may be things that we ought to keep in mind to maybe reduce harm or potential harm.
So I just want to clarify really quickly, in case audience members are not aware, the descriptive norm idea is just that even if you state a norm descriptively, people may still follow it, right? Even if it's presented as bad, right? There's a tendency for people to follow norms. Yeah, just wanted to clarify that in case people weren't familiar with the concept. Great, Morgan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, that was a really interesting insight too, Uwe. I think I've also been thinking about implicit attitudes and how, like, actually an idea that you mentioned earlier in our talk about kind of robustness and the importance of having multiple measures. So one thing that I've noticed social psychologists have done in response to the kinds of concerns about how actually to characterize what implicit attitudes are. I mean, so originally there was this idea that they're kind of unconsciously held, but then there was some empirical results showing, people could predict the direction of their scores on certain measures of implicit attitudes, and other reasons for thinking that they're not actually unconscious in that strong sense. So actually one thing social psychologists have done is to actually define implicit attitudes as whatever it is that's being measured by certain kinds of indirect measures. So instead of asking people about their kind of explicitly held attitudes in a self-report way, one thing that researchers do is have people take certain kinds of tests that are trying to probe associations between kind of social categories and evaluative categories. So if you have a kind of negative evaluation of women and a positive one of men, for example. And they do this by appealing to multiple different measures. So this is a kind of robustness argument or triangulation argument, as philosophers of science talk about it. But I think actually this is a really difficult case to make that kind of argument because it's not actually clear that what's being measured by all of these measures is the same thing. I think it's a live hypothesis that some of these measures are actually measuring different kinds of psychological phenomena, and that we're kind of assuming that they all kind of measure the same thing because we have these ways of trying to associate when different measures that are supposed to measure the same thing actually are. So in psychology, when you want to evaluate, whether these measures are actually all measuring the same thing, you're evaluating convergent validity of different methods. And in psychology, the common practice is just to look at correlation coefficients. So you look at the scores on these different measures and you see how well they correlate with each other. You would expect reasonably high correlation if they're measuring the same thing. And also, you should expect some amount of variation. There's often noise in the data, and some issues with these tests is that they don't have very good test-retest reliability. So sometimes people's scores vary over time. So you have to be sensitive that it's not going to be a perfect correlation. But I think this is actually a place where values can play a role. So this is like coming back into the picture, that there's a straightforward case of an inductive risk here. We have to make a judgment about what a sufficient level of correlation would count in this context for convergent validity. And in order to make this kind of judgment, like what's a sufficient level of evidence for the claim that these methods have convergent validity, we're kind of appealing to particular assessments of what the harm would be of accepting that particular standard. So I think it's exactly these kinds of questions that Uwe was just raising. Now that we know how much implicit attitudes have taken over as the kind of way we do anti-discrimination trainings, or the way we teach about bias and anti-racist views in our courses. I mean, if we come out and say, we have not very good evidence, but we think implicit attitudes are real and they fill this role, I mean, that's a real risk that we actually have to go back on our word when we get potentially more evidence, like if it turns out these are different phenomena. And that has really disastrous consequences for public communication about these things. So this was, my take on the issue.
Yeah, so I really like that way of thinking about it, and I think that helped me sort of think through it. So here's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say that like I'm kind of like agnostic, ambivalent about the concept of implicit bias in general, because I feel like there's this general problem of like when a concept is not working, and I mean that in the broadest sense, then there's like this choice of either like sort of abandoning this concept or like fixing it, ameliorating it in some way, right? And this is not just like for social concepts. In science concepts, this happens all the time, right? And like I feel like implicit bias is like at that stage, and I feel like what Morgan just said was really helpful in thinking about like maybe what value can play a role in making this choice of like abandoning or like fixing it, right? And I know like some people are very in favor of just abandoning, like Edouard Marchery, and like, but like people like Jennifer Saul have made an argument for kind of given that it's already being used in these like corporate educational settings, like let's try to make a useful version of this concept. So like more like on the fixing it side. As far as I understand, even the proponents of the implicit bias concept nowadays, like people like Keith Payne, buy into a more environmental rather than individualistic interpretation of implicit bias. And maybe that's one way of fixing it. Like whatever it's tracking, it's not quite in like someone's brain, but in their environment, which I think makes a lot of sense. And it's like also like sort of foreshadowed by works in philosophy by people like Sally Haslinger and Bryce Huebner on implicit bias, Valerie Soon too. So like, so I think that picture makes a lot of sense, and maybe that's like one way of kind of letting a concept drift in more in that direction, but preserving it. Ultimately, I think I'm still kind of agnostic, ambivalent about it. But I think Morgan's response was really helpful for me to see why values might play a role in precisely this choice of like whether we should try to fix in some way or whether we should kind of abandon a concept altogether.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really good point. And it really does tie back into the science communication idea as well, right? That's one place where like our epistemic and social values are like really intersecting. having been through these trainings, I can confirm that the presentation of implicit bias is this monolithic, universal, very causally powerful kind of thing. And I think one could probably believe in it in the broad sense without signing on for that kind of monolithic approach to it. So yeah, this is really, and I like the idea that the values can help determine whether we explicate or abandon. I think that's like a really nice, incisive point where that can come in.
Can I maybe just come in there? Or
yeah, sure.
so I think it's sort of, I think I also like the point, but I wonder about sort of the extent to which you want to be explicit about that, because there are going to be people out there, right? You tell them that this is why you want to hold on to the concept, right? Because you've got these commitments, these political commitments. And then, I mean, Morgan, you said public trust, right? Unfortunately, if you look at, I mean, Germany is, you know, or take the US, maybe it's more clear cut. I mean, you have a lot of people that are going to be critical of the implicit bias program, and if you tell them, well, we want to hold on to the concept because we want to make things better, that isn't going to convince them. In fact, this is going to alienate them. They're going to say, well, these are the scientists, these are the philosophers, they do their thing, they call it an agenda, right? So what would be, again, maybe a better idea is, I'm not saying that this is a better, I'm just saying that maybe we want to then, it's about how are we going to structure the environment in which we try to implement this. I mean, if you have a diverse group where you've got say conservative people too, like people that actually are critical of the program, that, you know, they are part of the discussion, maybe that would then help with the idea of, you know, holding on to the concept without undermining public trust, because then you can say, well, look, these people too, they contributed and they also realized actually it's good for them too to hold on to the notion, because politically there's political implicit bias too, right? And they are affected too. So maybe they also want to retain the notion a little bit, right? So I think you know, there's, yeah, again, it's maybe complex because it all relates to how we're going to do this practically, right, in a social environment.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you just brought up too is like a broader one in philosophy of science right now, is this idea, if we do have values in science and they're not just at the stages of like, what research projects should we pursue, but at the level of, you know, what kinds of data is relevant for this hypothesis, or you know, how should we actually characterize this particular concept and what measurement process should we use? How are we supposed to make those kinds of value choices? And one of the ideas that people have been proposing is we need the actual public to be involved in these kinds of value judgments. There's a lot of reasons that are given for this, and I actually think that they're not well separated. I think that you might have political reasons because you want a kind of politically legitimate, like scientifically informed policy outcome of a particular research program, but you also might have like ethical considerations where particular communities are affected by the research and you want them to have a say in how that research goes. Or you may have kind of epistemological reasons related to standpoint theory where people have particular knowledge that will impact how that research goes. So I think these are like broader, interesting questions also in philosophy of science, not just cognitive science.
Yeah, awesome, cool. That all is really useful and really just helps me again understand like the richness of some of these considerations in a way that I hadn't fully conceptualized. I really want to get this question in, and it may end up just being for Sam, which is totally okay with me. You know, I have like an undergraduate art history minor level of understanding of aesthetics. But Sam, you work a lot on the role of, for instance, imagination in aesthetic appreciation and so forth. Can you regale us a little bit about what that work is like, thinking about aesthetic values from a kind of cognitive science or philosophy of mind point of view?
Yeah. So when I was thinking about this question, I think the first thing I want to say is like, I feel like at least in philosophy, the sub area of aesthetics is just like a great playground for ideas, because like people are coming from all sorts of different sides. Like, some people do more mindy stuff, some people do more ethical stuff, but then it just ends up being like great playground of ideas. Then people talk about interesting little like specific cases, and we can think a lot about that. So I feel like aesthetics is just a place where I generally get to play with ideas a lot. So that's one reason where I think it's useful. So I feel like maybe here, maybe let me give a specific example. Sorry, before I give a specific example, I want to like also kind of sell aesthetics a little bit, because I like this quote by Peter Railton, because like people kind of readily see the importance of ethics, but they don't see the importance of aesthetics. So like Railton says, like, mere aesthetics, as if discussing and deciding about what we truly admire or detest were not a central shaping force in human life. And I think like there's something right about this in thinking about value more broadly, and like all the stuff that shape human life. So I think that's one reason to do some work in aesthetics. And I think sometimes when I do work in aesthetics, they end up informing my thoughts on other domains too. And I'll just give a concrete example of this. So Aaron Meskin and I, a few years ago, undertook this project of doing like experimental philosophy in aesthetics. And there are lots of things that come out of that. I like this paper about like how art concepts in art are like dual character concepts. So I did that with Aaron and also Josh Knob. And I think that contributes to like the general dual character concept literature. But also like with Aaron, then we started thinking about certain properties, certain semantic properties of adjectives, like beautiful, and whether they're like gradable and what kind of standards they have, the dimensions they have. And sort of like when I was thinking about it, that was like one project, right? But like years down the line, recently I just did like another paper with Nat Henson of thinking about words like racist and sexist. What are the semantic properties of those terms and what kind of standards gets applied? And our finding is basically that they're kind of like gradable adjectives and they're relatively minimum standard, so they allow for broad application, contrary to what many people claim, which a lot of people think like they should be applied as narrowly as possible. But in fact, like in ordinary language, people already use it in a broad sense. And it's also broad sense in that it's disjunctively multidimensional. So you can use like all these like semantic tests and like use corpus to figure out this stuff, right? But I don't think I would have done this project without like some of the earlier work in doing like experimental philosophy stuff in aesthetics, thinking about aesthetic communication. So I just want to stress, like, at least in my own experience, aesthetics has been like a really great playground of ideas that help me get into these other projects. And they're all kind of projects that relate to the intersection of like mind and value in some way.
Cool, yeah, thanks. Really wanted to make sure we got that question in because I find this stuff really fascinating. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. Quickly, if we could. So all of you have done, work a little bit in the public sphere, have done, work, at least in teaching, working towards bettering the field of philosophy in some ways or other. I just want to kind of ask what you think philosophers have distinctive to offer to public discourse, kind of in the realms of things that we've talked about. So I mean, like the implicit bias case would be one potentially really good case. So can we kind of go around the horn and just get our last kind of thoughts on how we should act with this knowledge, qua philosophers, in the world. So I guess Morgan, we'll start with you, and then we'll kind of loop around, and then we'll make an end here.
Yeah, I think philosophers, and especially philosophers of cognitive science or philosophers of science, have some really nice tools to offer, because kind of what we want to do in this domain is connect the kinds of social and political and ethical questions and ways of kind of more deeply understanding some of the concerns or concepts that we're interested in with the kind of scientific research and the kinds of considerations of how evidence is evaluated and when we are justified in our inferences, or what kinds of epistemic risks might arise. And I think philosophers who are interested in science and work with science are well suited for this kind of translation of the kind of issues, because they kind of straddle both sides of this kind of divide. So I don't know if philosophers are unique in this sense, but they at least have something good to contribute. But I have been convinced a little bit by what Uwe has been saying, that we need maybe more consideration of also public communication.
Cool. Thanks. Sam, any closing thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I'm also not convinced that philosophers have anything unique in the sense of like, so I guess here's what I think, right? Like, these are like, many of these topics are really relevant to our lives, and people from all sorts of disciplines can contribute, right? And if what we've been saying about the epistemic benefits about cognitive diversity is right, surely there's some benefits to having philosophers in the mix, given our particular disciplinary training. We might be lacking in some areas, but like, for example, I think of my own research as like much more like abstract and broad, like because like it just walks into all sorts of places. It walks to aesthetics and to social philosophy and to cognitive science, and maybe there's some value in that. And obviously that's going to miss out on some details too, right? But I think there's a kind of cognitive diversity argument for the inclusion of philosophers in public discourse alongside psychologists and critical race theorists and people from all sorts of other disciplines.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's yeah. I think I just agree with that by reasoning. Okay, cool. Uwe, do you want to have the last word here?
Yes, so I agree with what Morgan and what Sam just said, basically, and I just want to maybe just add another dimension there. So I think, Sam, what you said about sort of philosophers can integrate things, and they can sort of bring in the ethics and look at the methodology and conceptual foundations. I think that's really important. But I think what philosophers are maybe also what they can do, maybe, and I don't think they're unique. I agree with you, Sam, that I don't think they have a particular unique trait there. But I think what they can do is they can think outside the box, right? But scientists, they can't. I mean, they typically have their box. I mean, a biologist, they're going to focus on biology. Psychologists, they do psychology. And what philosophers can do, I think they can bring all these sciences together, and then sometimes you find findings data from in social psychology that is actually relevant for the public domain or for other areas of, say, psychology or maybe in biology, and they don't see it because they are just running as experiments, right, in social psychology. So what philosophers, I think, can do is they can just come in there and connect the dots, right, and make explicit the connections. And I think that's kind of really important. But I think there's also a risk there that I just want to maybe highlight, and I think it's sort of important. So when philosophers, and I include myself there too, so when philosophers do these things, when they integrate these different sciences, they don't always have the skill to actually work out, what the scientists are actually trying to say with their studies. Here, they don't really know the details of the methodology. And just to give one example, if you look at really kind of influential work in philosophy of cognitive science. I mean, take for instance, Peter, we were talking about introspection, take Peter Carruthers's work. What you get there is basically you get lots of literature reviews, right? And that's fine. These reviews, they support a particular theory. But if you look at what scientists typically say when they look at reviews, they draw a distinction between systematic reviews, narrative reviews, and meta-analyses, right? And what you get in philosophy, you get narrative reviews, and you get these really broad claims on the basis of narrative reviews. Now, if you ask a scientist what they think of a narrative review, they're going to say, well, the epistemic standing of a narrative review is relatively low. Why? Well, because it's not being conducted with the needed rigor, right? It's not, they don't pre-register the structure, right? Because if you're doing a systematic review, you actually pre-specify, selection criteria, and importantly, you try to be comprehensive. You try to include all studies available on the topic. Now, if you look at philosophers' work, like on introspection, it's very selective. It's narrative, it's compelling, but it's just what philosophers then may not realize is that really that is just a narrative review. So we may want to just, conduct research, integrative research there that's more kind of, that's maybe more sciencey, that's actually systematic, so that we can have more solid claim, right, a more solid foundation to base our claims on. And I think this is sort of a risk because philosophers are not quite trained in these methodological things. I mean, but that's maybe just my personal view. I don't know what you think of that. And
I don't know. I think I guess another thing with this question is what is a philosopher anyway? Who knows? So I mean, but just in thinking about doing systematic meta-analysis, Eduard Marcheri and David Colasso and another co-author who I remember, they recently did these meta-analysis, right? And then they have a systematic selection criteria about which studies to include. So I think some philosophers can definitely do the work too. I guess there are lots of different philosophers. They probably all have some good things and bad things about them. Let's get them into a picture.
I will say also, some philosophers now are doing qualitative interviews with scientists as well to try to figure out what they actually do think and do more careful inferences based on kind of their responses to specific questions. Yeah. So, but it is a general risk. You're right. We should make sure that we're doing these things well.
Well, it's already very late here, and now I'm going to be up all night thinking about whether my literature reviews are just narratives.
there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, narrative.
But even within the philosophical approach, I think what we're seeing is there's kind of a diversity of methods and a diversity of ways of engaging with empirical literatures. I mean, one of the themes that's come up is we've had these kinds of questions over and over again in the roundtable is the opportunities, but also really the challenges of bringing a distinctively, to whatever degree there is a distinctive philosophical skill set into the empirical world, and thus serving science communication is just there's just a lot of methodological requirements from multiple fields if you're going to do that rigorously. So at Brains we tend to really pump the tires of interdisciplinarity, but it's also good to realize that there's a huge kind of intellectual challenge there in doing it well. Good. That seems like a good thing to end on, a lot of hope, but a little bit of tempering as well. So this was fantastic. I really enjoyed this. Thank you all so much for being here. I will be we'll be posting this video soon, and I want to thank everyone watching the video. Thank you so much for joining us, and please tune in to future sessions of Brains blog roundtables. Good night.